Hey everyone, and welcome back. So, after having covered melee and ranged, it is now time for us to take on the tanks. And it's interesting, in the move from 7.3 of Legion to BFA, everyone felt significantly weaker, and they pretty much remained that way. And I think few felt this more than the tanks, who went from being these unkillable juggernauts to, very killable juggernauts, and the intent seems to have actually made it so the tanks had to actually rely on healers, rather than the healers just sort of existing more or less as a backup, as it kind of worked in bits of Legion. Now in Shadowlands, well, tanking feels much the same as BFA, although the unpruning has actually provided more tools to handle certain sticky situations. Those extra tools do help out most classes, although some other changes I think have done more harm than good. So if you are interested in tanking as a thing, well, the choice of spec can be really daunting. There's some big changes here and a lot to talk about. So just like how we did things for the DPS specs, today we're going to do it for the tanks. We're going to focus on the changes, how they play, and where their toolkits feel both fun and strong. So be sure to like and sub for more class stuff like this. And as an early peek into June's Patreon loot, well, this month's pin is the Druid class pin, and well, it just shipped to our office, so I'll be able to show it to you in person pretty soon. Okay, with that said, let's get into the video. First off, Blood DK. So they've got a lot more buttons. Anti-magic zone, raise dead, and sacrificial pact being there across the class gives them some extra tools for group utility and personal survivability. Then Blood itself has actually picked up Rune Tap and Blood Tap baseline, and the latter is quite a nice addition, being a button that grants one rune on demand every minute and has 2 charges. It's not massive, of course, but using it effectively will smooth out the rotation nicely, not to mention that it's also a bit of an old favorite. Then Rune Tap, that sounds great to have, but it's only a 20% reduction for 4 seconds, and it does cost 1 rune. It, I think, sounds, better than nothing, right? But there are some concerns that maybe it's a bit of a noob trap where, it looks fine, but the 15 runic power from a Heart Strike could maybe be more valuable in some other cases. Really, I think it's the case where a short duration damage reduction cooldown like that one is supposed to feel a bit like Survival Instincts does, powerful when it's used right, but 20% is just not enough to make it really feel like it's worth a GCD. And yeah, you also heard that correctly, Rune Tap is on the global cooldown. Now, overall, and all of that said, the goal of the unpruning from Blizz is mostly to give players some new tools, right? Give them some tools back and to see how they make use of them, and certainly there's a fair bit of that going on with the DKs. Now, when we move over to the talent tree, well, they've got some pretty nice improvements with some shuffling, allowing for a bit more choice to be made, something that Blood really has been suffering from a bit. So Tombstone replaces Rune Strike, and Tombstone's old spot on the tree now has Relish in Blood. It's a new passive that adds a burst of healing and runic power when using the free Death and Decay procs. Then Mark of Blood has moved, the chunky Death Pact is now in the tree for a burst of emergency healing, and Voracious now also increases Death Strike's healing by 20%, which is a real solid passive. So all in all, when we look at this, right, the changes are largely positive, and the solid core of this spec does remain intact. Like all tanks, it's basically a simple DPS rotation with a core resource to be built up and used in defensives, in this case building up RP, runic power for Death Strikes to heal up. The maintenance of Bone Shield isn't always that fun, but it does reward using Marrow Rend effectively. Really, the fun, I suppose, in Blood, that comes from using those limited Death Strikes optimally, while using the likes of Anti-Magic Shell and Vampiric Blood properly. Now, coming in from 8-3, it's going to be a bit of a pain because of low secondaries, but that said, Blood is still likely to remain strong. They have consistent sustain, the ever-useful Gorefiend's Grasp, and plenty of ways to deal with all forms of incoming damage. Honestly, because of all that, it's hard to think of a reason not to play Blood. Their talent tree could use a stronger rebalance, and playing one is not the most exciting thing when you're not in danger, but the spec in most cases does flow pretty well, especially with the addition of Blood Tap. Really, with this spec, it's another case of very minor improvements on an already fine spec, ultimately just making it feel a bit more polished. But that said, I just wish the Dancing Rune weapon didn't feel so close to useless. Next then, we got the Vengeance Demon Hunter. So there are some positive looking changes here, but there is also just real concerns that were not addressed in a meaningful way. So Fell Devastation is now baseline. I think that's great. That's pretty cool. And the new Demonic talent actually gives you a few seconds in Metamorphosis after using it, just like Havoc. So that is pretty nice. They also have new talents in the bottom row. There's Bulk Extraction and Ruinous Bulwark. So Bulk Extraction is basically a DPS / self-heal cooldown, and Bulwark is a flat buff to the healing from Fell Devastation. Now, the concerns that I mentioned with this one, they're split between the talents and then just some core design questions. So without Spirit Bomb, okay, Vengeance has surprisingly little damage and AoE threat, and honestly, most of the talents are just a bit unbalanced. Now, to combat this, there has been a decent amount of reshuffling of things. So Spirit Bomb, as an example, has been moved in with Charred Flesh and Infernal Armor, which I think basically just means that Spirit Bomb is just always going to be picked unless the 20% armor from Infernal turns out to be notably better. As far as most are concerned, though, these are pretty minor, right, improvements, right, minor changes, and they don't really change what build people would be likely to go for. And while we're still on the topic of talents, there's one small thing here. Why is there a talent that basically is just a macro as a talent? Because Concentrated Sigils, yes, it does buff their duration a bit, sure, but it also makes them cast underneath the player. That is literally the same as doing an @player macro. So come on, like, Blizz, that's just a wasted talent. You could do better there. Personally, look, I'll say this. I quite like the idea of Vengeance, but there's just quirks that get in the way. Soul Cleave being mostly useless is still a problem, and it's not one solved by the talent reshuffle. The talents that improve Soul Cleave may help, but they're walled behind much better and more fun options. So at its core, right, Vengeance, it's working off two resources, building up your Fury, and then ripping the Soul Frags from your enemies. But the thing is that Soul Cleave spends Fury and heals for more based on the Soul Fragments, so it kind of locks those two resources together in a pretty darn awkward way. There's no baseline method to put Fury or Fragments individually to good use, and in fact, half of the reason why people would pick Spirit Bomb is they could properly use Fragments. They could actually plan around that, and that's why I actually think that if Spirit Bomb is just going to be used by Blizz in the way that it is currently, just make it baseline and put a new talent in there. Come on. So it's a bit weird. I think the success, basically, right, that's been found in the resource management gameplay of other tank specs, like maybe the Blood DK, that's just not found here. It just doesn't work as well. Now, I'll say the fundamentals of the spec feel pretty good otherwise, and just being a DH is pretty fun, but I think it just does need a little bit more thought and some nicer talents to actually feel complete to me. Now, balance aside, their kit does have lots of self-healing, survivability, movement, and more, so they do have much of what they need, pretty much everything they need to succeed. So for most scenarios, they should feel perfectly viable, perfectly fine. And I personally like the idea behind this spec. It's just that for me, it doesn't really play that well, and I would have liked to have seen quite a bit more in terms of changes for this one. So suffice to say, I hope it sees very good legendaries and more changes over the alpha. Right now, I'd say I would be hard-pressed to recommend it. Guardian Druid time. So this is another class with minimal changes, even though, honestly, it, I think, needed a lot more. I guess fundamentally, even without going into the specifics of the gameplay mechanics, what I can say is in Legion and in BFA, this one bored the pants off me, and it's still fundamentally going to be doing that. Now, at its core, this spec is just still doing a very basic DPS rotation and then spending Rage on either Iron Fur or Frenzied Regeneration, depending on what is appropriate. But sadly, Frenzied Regen feels a bit limp in comparison to Word of Glory for the for the Paladins, or Deathstrike for the Blood DKs. Sustain is not their strong point, and they generally lack interesting defensive options as compared to others, in my opinion. Now, to their benefit, they've got the utility that all druids have, right, because they're druids, but as tanks, swapping your form could be, really limiting your sustainability, so that's maybe not something you'll want to be doing. So while a Paladin can drop Lay on Hands to an ally without, a second thought, Guardians need to risk leaving Bear form to get any substantial, off-healing or damage from their affinity. So that stuff isn't really working as well for them. And Shadowlands really doesn't do them any favors on the utility front either. Stampeding Roar, that was a strong case for bringing a Guardian Druid to a raid, but now the other specs can do that, so it's a positive for all of the druids, but a negative for the Guardians specifically in comparison. Now, in addition, they also have to choose between Typhoon or Ursol's Vortex rather than having access to both. Now, they have got some new stuff like Renewal, a strong self-heal on demand that theoretically would help them out, but it's on the same talent row as Wild Charge, so not having a way to move quickly into combat baseline, I mean, that's something that, because it's a talent, right, it's not baseline, that's a pretty major disadvantage as compared to a bunch of other tanks. Even the DKs have got Death's Advance and their grips to help them out on that front. There's then also some more changes to address. So Pulverize, one of their bottom row talents, that's been changed, right, from reducing all damage taken to just reducing damage taken from the target who has been pulverized. That's clearly a notable nerf, as it also lasts half as long and has a 30-second cooldown. So while it might seem better to play and a bit more interactive because it's no longer just a simple maintenance debuff, I think in other ways it's going to feel worse in terms of the power of the kit. They also, though, do get Berserk as a 3-minute cooldown. It reduces the cooldowns of the DPS abilities and Frenzied Regeneration, as well as having the cost of Iron Fur for 15 seconds. Now, this turns it into a combined DPS and survivability cooldown, and that's something they have been missing outside of their Incarnation talent, but 15 seconds every 3 minutes is frustratingly little when I think that the rest of the spec just feels like it doesn't have that much interesting going on. So overall, I would say the Guardian Druid is not in a great spot. I don't think it brings much of anything special to the table, especially as some of the positives of being a Druid are diminished by needing to stay in Bear. Heart of the Wild won't let you save a dying teammate or pump out more damage if you're still actively trying to tank. So that will be useful, say in an off-tank scenario, but those are still fairly rare. So overall, I would expect that it's going to survive most encounters, through the expansion. It will be able to get its job done, but I would then say that there's very limited reason to pick one up over something else that is more versatile and fun, which really, in my opinion, is most of the rest of this video. Brewmaster Monk time. This is pretty substantial, actually, with some old gameplay returning in a new way and, well, a pretty major change. So, first off, a small thing, they should now be able to dual wield or use a two-hander, although that's not on alpha right now. It's not massive, but it is welcome, I suppose. Now, a minor change that has happened to facilitate this is that Blackout Strike is now Blackout Kick. Why is that? Well, pretty simple. If it's a kick, then you don't need to make new animations for dual wielding, so that's what's going on there. Continuing on, though, to the more gameplay impacting stuff, well, Brewmasters are losing Ironskin Brew. That's a bit wild, and instead they're getting the passive Shuffle. So basically, Ironskin's effect of increasing stagger percentage is there, but it's on a passive that activates when using your core DPS abilities. Now, the departing Ironskin Brew has then been replaced with a new one. It's called Celestial Brew. Now, it is effectively a brew version of Guard that gives the monk a chunky shield. So in theory, what happens here, right, is it creates a nice relationship between absorbing damage and purifying stagger, so using your two brews, the purifying one and the celestial one. However, purifying brew actually stacks a buff that increases the next celestial brew's shield, which is, I guess, a nice bit of interactivity between them, but the brews then also don't share charges. And that is really very different to the gameplay of the past. It's quite a shakeup. So in order to enforce Celestial Brew's use, right, to actually make having that Absorb Shield be a thing that you're going to be wanting to do instead of the Purifying all the time, well, what happens there is that Stagger no longer impacts magic damage. And that means that if magic damage is going to come in, you are going to need to use that Celestial in order to get a shield up so you can tank that magic damage. And I suppose that's why I kind of think they should share charges, right? So that is a choice and that there's resource management there, because right now there's not really a decision to be made in a situation like that. So it's a bit weird. I mean, if this is a reaction to stagger and magic damage being like a balance concern for mythic progression, that's fine, but I mean, it shouldn't really be a gameplay downgrade, so a little bit weird. Now, as for other additions, well, Nu Zhao is now available to Drunk Monks the same way that Zhuan is available for Windwalkers, so he's baseline, as is Spinning Crane Kick and Touch of Death, and that is all, pretty good stuff, really. Now, over on the talent front, Guard is now obviously a baseline thing in the form of this new Celestial Brew, so its spot has been taken by a new talent called Celestial Flames. Now, this talent gives a chance for brews to buff the monk, increasing the damage reduction for Breath of Fire, and then letting Spinning Crane Kick actually apply that, which I think is pretty cool. Nu Zhao's spot has then been taken by Exploding Keg, which is a chunk of AoE damage and causes targets to miss attacks for 3 seconds. All in all, there's really no other changes that are worth discussing. It's fairly similar, but the difference in using brews is definitely weird. It's not what you will have been used to if you've been playing it for the last 2 expansions, and there's bits of it that don't feel quite right in its current iteration. I suppose the additions are cool in principle, right? Moving to this Purifying Brew / Celestial Brew setup. I understand that, right? You're managing your stagger, but then also you're managing an absorb shield. But there's also some ways where it just feels a bit less interesting than the old method, which was hyper-focused on stagger as a mechanic, with both of your brews being very tied into that. I suppose it's easier to grasp this new way of things. It's easier to grasp, right? Without having to figure out, which brew do you use in order to manage stagger? Do I purify it now? Do I use fortifying brew now? But the thing is that balance between do I purify, do I fortify, that was kind of how brewmasters played. It was a part of what made them unique, and now it's not really as much of a thing. So I expect that this will be a bit controversial to the existing brewmaster monks, but I think it will probably still just play completely fine and be decently fun to the newer monks who didn't really get deep into that spec and therefore wouldn't have like a strong emotional attachment to the old interplay of the stagger mechanic. So there you go. It's honestly an interesting one. I think I'm pretty much in the middle on it. So overall, if you've been really playing a lot of Brewmaster, because really the last time I played that properly was Legion. So yeah, if you've got a big thought there, do let me know down below. I'm very keen to see what you think. Next up, we've got the Protection Paladin, and this really is a tank that's seen a fundamental change because, as opposed to the resource system that we've been used to, they're actually now back to using Holy Power as their resource, no longer relying on a basic charge system for Shield of the Righteousness. Light of the Protector has been replaced by Word of Glory, so they now have some choices to make with their resources. And this should increase the uptime and Shield of the Righteous overall, but it does add the notable cost of using that, spending your Holy Power, which then will throw off your heals, because your heals also will, of course, come from that Holy Power. So overall, I would say that actually should be a more positive, engaging way to play, right? I actually think there's more gameplay in this setup. Now, that's not where the changes end, though, because they've also got Holy Avenger and Divine Purpose as talents to interact with that Holy Power. Then, since Word of Glory can target allies by default, the Hand of the Protector talent now adds back in the missing health component when cast on other targets, allowing you to do that as well. Now, some existing talents have been changed up significantly too. Redoubt now has been changed to a stacking strength and stamina buff when Shield of the Righteousness is used, and First Avenger adds bounces to Avenger's shield that grants an absorb shield when it hits. So, in my opinion, that's actually some pretty smart reusing of 2 Azerite traits. Pretty cool stuff. Now, they have lost a few things, right? Like the old Retribution Aura, Bastion of Light, and Aegis of Light. Red Aura won't really be missed because it was so useless, although Aegis was a cool ability, but limited in its use. It's one that I'm personally a bit sad to see gone rather than improved, but that's what's ended up happening with it. Then the last new talent that they picked up is really fun. It is Moment of Glory. So, every attack against the Paladin during Ardent Defender will trigger their Avenger shield to reset. Now, this might not be the most useful thing, but combining that with Holy Avenger or Seraphim, it will be quite fun. Good luck casting spells. So, right, they'll be pressing the same buttons, but basically it's going to feel pretty different. The same damage rotation as always, but this time it properly has an impact to your core resources because, of course, it's all about Holy Power now. Now, this does make him a bit slower. Hammer of the Righteous is up to a 6-second recharge as an example, but honestly, relying on Holy Power to be defensive or to heal, I think that is a bit more natural than before, and the slower pace should help to just avoid being GCD locked with pointless feeling filler abilities. Matt and our team is completely sick of pure filler. Playing a Prot Paladin in Legion actually led to him having a brief run with RSI thanks to pressing Blessed Hammer all day. But I mean, that's sort of beside the point. I actually think that stuff just feels a bit more intentional and better with these changes, right? I actually think the spec does feel better. Protection Paladins, I think overall, feel like the quintessential support tank. They can heal themselves and their allies and protect their allies directly with blessings. Now, out by merely existing, their auras will provide a defensive benefit. Basically, they have defensive and support tools for many situations, as well as a surprising burst damage when it's needed. That, and the Interrupt and Avenger Shield, makes them just really quite a favorite, to be honest with you. They may not be able to impact their enemies as much as they can instead help their allies, and they might take a long time to get anywhere, of course, because they still are paladins, but I think they're excellent tanks and they're really fun with their design, and I would highly recommend playing a Protection Paladin if this sounds good to you, and especially if those supporting elements sound fun to you, because I think it's going in a really strong direction. The last spec then, Protection Warrior. The BFA changes didn't do them very well in the initial wave of gameplay of BFA, but they saw a huge amount of popularity once we figured out that they could press Avatar and then mash Thunderclap to top the meters with the right talents. So in Shadowlands, we unsurprisingly have seen a lot of talent shuffling going on, some of which is targeted at that interaction. Before that though, let's talk about the core changes. So of the Warrior baseline changes, what they'll care about is getting Execute and Whirlwind baseline, as well as challenging Shout, and with that, having an AoE taunt as a tank is going to be a lifesaver in the situations when it's needed. Then Revenge costs 10 less rage and has no cooldown, so it's now a way to just infinitely dump your rage as damage. The talent that affected it then, Best Served Cold, now actually just makes it stronger too. On the talent tree, it is mostly the same talents but in a very different order. Most notably, Into the Fray, Booming Voice, and Unstoppable Force are now on the same row. Now, the interplay between these three talents is what made the Warrior's immense Thunderclap damage possible, so that's no longer going to be a thing. And interestingly, balance-wise, Into the Fray is down to 10% haste from 15, and Booming Voice adds 20% damage instead of 15. Now, they've also lost Safeguard and Vengeance in the move, instead getting War Machine and Double Time. Yeah, they used to get a baseline, and now it's a choice. I guess that's a bit more parity with the other Warrior specs, even if it is something that's kinda painful. So without going into too much detail, the general shift here theoretically does open up more build options, right? Because sort of must picks are now on the same talent row instead of taking up multiple, and therefore kind of locking multiple talent rows really out of having much of a choice. So it does that, but it's in an awkward way because the overlap of those really loved talents not only nerfs the spec, but using Booming Voice and Unstoppable Force was fun. But now, of course, they're exclusive and on the same row. Then, in addition, Anger Management no longer reduces the cooldown of Demoralizing Shout and Last Stand, which again isn't really going to feel that great. Now, on the bright side, Indomitable now grants the Long Mist heal when spending Rage Effect from the Legion Legendary Bracer, so I guess that's pretty cool. Overall, though, the spec does feel like it was nerfed pretty heavily, and I say that in terms of gameplay feel. Now, this, of course, will probably be made up for with numbers tuning, and I imagine it will be able to do its job just fine, but it's just not really going to feel that great for a bunch of players. I mean, they feel a hell of a lot slower right now, and it, I think, is a bit intentional. So if you're coming to this fresh, right, at least there'll be a lot more decision making in your talents, and it still will function pretty decently. You'll probably have fun, but looking at the community feedback, it seems like this overall is quite a messy situation and hurts what a whole bunch of Warriors actually found enjoyable recently. I guess it could be a case of balance at the expense of fun, which is a class design staple it's always a problem to wrestle with. Now, if you put those negatives aside, in many ways it doesn't hurt the core, right? And I will still say that the Prot Warrior feels compelling-ish, right? Like the rhythm of Thunderclap and Shield Slam while spending Rage and Shield Block or Ignore Pain, or maybe Ravage to do some damage. I think that fundamentally is a fun thing, and I think Avatar is still a really satisfying cooldown to use. And I mean, Warriors are Warriors. They've got Intercept, they've got Heroic Leap, and that means they're really mobile in combat. Shockwave and the various shouts provide combat utility, and it feels like Warriors can control their enemies quite well through those things. So that stuff's all good, and all in all, it's not a bad spec. There are just some kind of dead and unbalanced talents and a situation where Shadowlands likely will not feel great for experienced BFA Protection Warrior tanks. So to wrap up this video, there are cases where picking a weaker class can be a good choice if it's more fun for you, but I think tanks don't really fit that really too well. As far as I'm concerned, the most enjoyable ones are really the ones with the most tools that can do the most stuff in a fight. I think that's in many ways what being a tank is all about, staying alive and then keeping the fight going as smoothly as is possible. There's a clear discrepancy, therefore, in what these tanks can do, and I think the only three that are well realized or close to it are the two protections and blood. Brewmaster is a cool fantasy, but I think does Drunken Martial Arts really mesh into WoW's gameplay that well? Who knows? As a quick fix, I think more choice in how gameplay pans out with the brews would improve it, although it's no way terrible the way it stands, right? It's just, it feels like it's in a transitionary period, I suppose. Now, for Guardian, that just seems lackluster. Comparing it to other tanks, I think it's really quite lacking, especially since being a bear, hurts its uniqueness, right? Locks you into the bear, and that kind of damages some of your options as a druid if you're the main tank, and that's a situation where maybe the paladins won't have that trade-off. And then as for Vengeance, it just doesn't feel that good to play with its core rotation, even if its mobility is super strong and parts of its core fantasy are really fun as well. Now, on the positive side of things, Blood is a great spec for a whole variety of reasons, and Prot Paladin is pretty much the same, right? It's fantastic, even if the two specs are kind of polar opposites in terms of how they play. I mean, certainly because of that, I would recommend that you try out both of them and work out which one you enjoy the most, because they are really strong and they would be the top two recommendations from this video based on how things are panning out thus far. Overall, I'd say that a fairly mediocre job was done with the tanks from Blizz. Once more, the ones that feel the best are simple cases of not being broken in the first place, and it does feel like the ones that felt a bit broken or really like they needed some love just weren't given the fixes that they need. They weren't given the care that they deserved. And I find myself thinking the same thing as in many of our other videos here. The class design team need to be a lot more forthcoming with their goals and their plans if they want to get good feedback. And I think doing the unpruning is fine and cool, but there are fundamental gameplay issues within specs that I think often fall outside of the scope of just the unpruning, and that's really the area where I don't think we're seeing as much change or improvement into Shadowlands as many players would probably like to see. And I do commend the alpha being up and the improvements that are on the alpha, but I think that giving truly actionable feedback is just not that feasible right now, because there is not nearly enough communication from Blizzard on their intent with a bunch of the changes that they're making, and just generally it feels like there needs to be a bunch more iteration. Now, it is good that the alpha seems to have happened pretty early and had all of the classes up on it, which does allow us to do a whole bunch of testing, but right now it really is hard to tell, and it's also hard to tell, if there are just things that we're identifying as holes, as just holes in these specs, right, that Blizzard actually intend to patch up with, say, a legendary effect. It's kind of hard to know that, but then I would say that if you've got holes in a specs design and the intent is to patch that up with a legendary effect, well, then when we move from 9.0 to 10.0, we're going to be left in the same thing, where the borrowed power is gone, and suddenly the specs feel way less well-rounded and capable. So overall, a tricky situation. TLDR for me, the real winners are Prot and Blood. I think it's a bit more mixed with Protection and Brewmaster, and then there is just, say, struggles for maybe aspects of the Protection Warrior and the Guardian Druid. So that's our thoughts after looking through all of this. Do let me know though, what do you think and what sort of changes would you like to see? So with that said, thank you very much for watching this video. Let me know what you think. And of course, if you want to check out the range DPS and the melee DPS, that's already on the channel, and healers will be coming shortly. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.